tornado friend, there has been many, many, many very, very strong tornadoes, and some are going to be on this list, and some may surprise you and some may not surprise you. And I want you to leave your comment on what was the strongest tornado of all time. And without further ado, we're going to start with this tornado that reportedly ripped foundations out of the ground. This tornado was possibly the strongest tornado in the whole entire 1974 super outbreak, and it did pull some foundations out of the ground, and this is according to surveyors and things like that. That is unheard of. No other tornado has done that. Not even Waco 1970, not even Smithville in 2011. None of those did that. This is a tornado in its own category, I believe. It's the only one where even I would consider, if they went up that high, as an F6 tornado. It's ridiculous how strong this was. And let's hope we never see something of that strength again. That is ridiculous. And on to the next one, which comes from another super outbreak. This tornado was one of the strongest, if not the strongest, tornado in the 2011 super outbreak. It caused houses to be not just picked up off their foundations. Some of the foundations actually got partially moved out of the ground. Yeah. This is almost on par with the Ewan 1974 one. Oh, the trenches this one dug, 2-foot trenches in the ground, sent a car flying through the air 1.25 miles into the water tower, and that car was never seen again. That is utterly ridiculous. Yeah, that tornado was absolutely God's finger and a real vacuum cleaner. Yeah, but this one was the true Hoover. It just sucked up everything and left nothing to the imagination, I'll tell you that. And there was probably one other tornado that did worse damage, but it's a little lower on my list due to it being a slower mover. But we'll talk about that one later. And now on to another tornado that happened during this super outbreak. Yes, the cell that caused this tornado actually caused another EF5 tornado in Mississippi. This would be the Rainsville, Alabama tornado. It also caused an EF4 in Cordova, and this cell did a lot of damage. This was the strongest tornado, I believe, from this cell, as it caused houses to be moved off their foundations, literally picked up whole off of their foundations, literally removed a safe that was literally drilled into the ground. Oh boy, that's a strong tornado, I'll tell you that. And another case of a car cars being thrown for miles and not being seen again. Oh, another tornado where even if you were underground, it was not safe at all. This is one of the cases of Your best bet is being underground, because above ground you're dead. You're dead. There's nothing you can do about it. This thing was like another version of a vacuum cleaner, and we're going to talk about a couple other tornadoes like this. This was probably the second to maybe third strongest tornado in the outbreak. People don't realize how strong this tornado really was. I mean, it was the strongest tornado that came out of this supercell after a couple of cycles. And I'm telling you what, this might be one of the strongest tornadoes on Earth ever. And let's hope that the 2011 super outbreak does not happen again. It probably will at some point, but let's hope not. And we're going to move on to another supercell from 2011 that happened on May 24th. You know the one. This tornado happened 2 days after the Joplin tornado. This one was probably one of the strongest tornadoes that have ever happened, as it recorded winds over 300 miles an hour gate to gate. Wow, that is one of the strongest tornadoes in history. And it removed homes from their foundations. It dug trenches in the ground. It pulled up asphalt out of the roadway. It killed many people. It also moved an oil rig that was 16 million pounds and picked it up and threw it. That is unbelievable. And I've seen very few tornadoes of that strength ever. I mean, ever. Not in that outbreak, not in any outbreak ever. I mean, like, that's right up there with the two previous tornadoes I mentioned in 2011. Not quite up to the standards of Gyu in 1974, but this was one of the strongest tornadoes of all time, and people need to realize that, because it gets understated. It's truly the forgotten EF5. And that's one thing I'm going to say is you cannot forget EF5s. Those are the worst ones to forget. And now on to the Bridge Creek Moore tornado, one of the strongest of all time. Speaking of one of the strongest tornadoes on Earth to ever happen, this one had gate-to-gate shear of 302 miles an hour measured by Doppler radar right outside of Bridge Creek. And of course, it wiped homes right off their foundations. It dug trenches a couple of feet deep near or just outside of Bridge Creek. And it was an EF4 to EF5, or F4 to F5, most of its life. I mean, I know it caused a tornado in Chickasaw, and the tornado cycled and then caused the one that would eventually go through Bridge Creek and more. And it became an F4 tornado right outside of Amber, and quickly strengthened to F5 just after that, as it was paralleling 44. Very, very congested highway usually, and you gotta be feel bad for those people because they knew it was there. And then it moved through Bridge Creek, like I said earlier. It removed homes from foundations. It dug trenches a couple feet deep, and everything was a total loss there. It was horrible. And then it moved into Newcastle and weakened a little bit to an F2, F3 tornado. And then as it got back to the highway, and crossed it, it had strengthened back to a high-end F4, and then as it moved into more, turned into an F5, and destroyed everything. It dug small trenches in the area. It moved a lot of homes off their foundations on the west side of Moore, and it was awful. And then it moved into the Tinker and caused F4 damage there, and caused F4 damage, high-end F4 damage in Del City and Midwest City. It was an awful tornado. And luckily it died out by the time it got to near the airport, Will Rogers. But this killed 36 people. It caused over $1 billion in damage. For 1999 standards, that's horrible. And this might have been one of the strongest tornadoes of all time. And now we're going to move on to the next tornado that happened in 1998. Well, everybody seems to remember the tornado, that hit Nashville as an F3. Nobody remembers the tornado that is one of the strongest tornadoes ever seen. And that was the Lawrenceburg, Tennessee tornado to its south. It was definitely one of the strongest tornadoes we have ever seen. It tore houses off their foundations. It literally pulled up some of the foundations, and it caused mass damage and trenches a few feet deep. I mean, only the strongest of tornadoes that have ever happened will do that. And this is the true forgotten F5 tornado. Nobody remembers it. And I don't understand why nobody remembers it. It killed 10 people. Well, the one to its north didn't kill anybody. I mean, it didn't hit any big population centers, thank God. But 10 people dying is too much, and you have to remember, this one was a real sucker. It sucked some foundations partially out of the ground, and that is something, like I said, makes for the strongest tornadoes. And now we're going to move on to a tornado that happened in 1990. This is the only F5 tornado that I know that did not have a tornado warning on it. They didn't know there was a tornado on it until the tornado had already roped out. It was one of the strongest tornadoes ever seen. It literally dug trenches into the ground. You could actually see them from the helicopter. It flattened many homes, and it also moved homes off their foundations, like picked them up. And it was a really bad tornado. It was probably not survivable above ground. Let's just say that. And it appeared in a low shear environment. It wasn't in a high shear environment. It was an unusual type tornado, similar to what happened with the Gerald tornado. But in this tornado, though, it wasn't warned. Nobody was following it. And when they said absolute destruction, they meant it. There was absolute destruction. Nothing left. It was a complete disaster. And let's hope this doesn't happen again. And on to the next tornado. Another one from the 1974 super outbreak was the Louisville tornado, and that one was one of the tornadoes that Dr. Fujita had said he would have considered an F6 on. Yeah. Also one of the strongest tornadoes of all time. It destroyed the city of Louisville. It absolutely flattened it, pancake flat. It removed homes from their foundations. It caused trenches in the ground. Yep, you get in the picture here. It was a clear F5. It was, you could say that based on ground truth, this was one of the strongest tornadoes that has ever happened in history. And some of the foundations have been partially pulled. Once again, only the strongest of tornadoes can do that. And I'm going to say this. That was another of many, many bad tornadoes in that outbreak. And now on to another tornado from another super outbreak from 2011. This is another major tornado that happened in the 2011 super outbreak. There was another EF5. It removed homes from their foundations. It dug trenches 2 feet deep again. It threw vehicles all over the place. It actually pulled doors off of underground bunkers. You weren't even safe underground with this one. Very dangerous, and the only thing that would probably save your life was being underground. And even that wasn't a guarantee with this one. 72 people died. That's just something you don't want to hear of. And it didn't happen in heavily populated areas. This was in a lesser populated area. And the fact that if you were above ground, you could not survive this. There was just no way to survive this above ground. You literally had to either get underground or get out of the way. That's about the only two things you could do. Well, other than kissing your butt goodbye. But this was one of the worst tornadoes in the history. It was definitely up there with Smithville, but just I'd say a step below. And I'll tell you what, let's just hope it never happens again, because this had F5 damage for 30, 40, 50 miles, and yeah, 4 damage for over 100 miles. It's a ridiculous tornado, and let's hope we never see anything like that again. And on to the next one. The most complete damage ever seen in a tornado was by this tornado. This tornado caused the most complete damage ever caused by a tornado. There wasn't even a shred of debris left on any of those foundations. And wow, this tornado I don't think was as strong as the previous tornadoes on the list. I believe because it was moving so slowly, it caused damage that was just unbelievable. Like, you would never know that there was estates there. You wouldn't know that people lived there. You wouldn't have known that there was even people there. They had to identify people by dental records. They had to distinguish human remains from animal remains. They couldn't do that. And the worst part is, this tornado was moving 10 miles per hour as a multi-vortex wedge tornado. And like I said, I don't think it was as strong as the previous ones on the list, but it was definitely a F5 strength. Even if it was moving 30 miles an hour, it would have caused F5 damage. I'm telling you. And while this might be the only other tornado in modern times that Dr. Fujita actually thought about calling an F6 once again. And I think this one was like 2 or 3 steps below like the Ewan, the Smithvilles, and all that. But because of its slow movement, it's right up there with those tornadoes. And let's hope we never see something like this again. And now on to the next tornado. Some of the damage that this tornado did is some of the most remarkable damage that's ever been done in a tornado. The debarking of trees, the trenches dug in the ground, and the complete damage of homes being swept off their foundations, and it was some of the worst damage ever seen. It was one of the strongest tornadoes that's ever been seen, and well, I don't think it's quite up to the top tier of tornadoes. It's right up there, though. It's pulled some piping out of the ground, which is almost impossible to do with a tornado. Almost impossible. It did some damage to well, we're going to talk about trenches in a few in other tornadoes too, and it absolutely killed quite a few people. I was actually surprised at how few it actually did kill, so be thankful for that. But it caused total annihilation of Parkersburg, and I'm hoping it doesn't happen again in that area, because that would be horrible. And now on to the next tornado. This is one of those tornadoes that was so destructive that Dr. Fujita had actually thought about making this one an F6 tornado too. The damage was complete. Houses wiped off their foundations, and there was a lot of windrowing in the fields. There was trenches dug like all the other tornadoes, and it might have been one of the strongest tornadoes of the outbreak. but it's also the most known one of the outbreak. As in, it was one of the most photographed and video taken of this tornado than any other tornado in the super outbreak of 1974. And yeah, it was horrible. A lot of people died, and this was in 1974, and the warnings were not as great as they are today, but they had warning. They knew they had a major tornado out there, and like all the ones above, this tornado was a wedge too. It was quite wide. It like I said, dug trenches in the ground. And let's hope this doesn't happen again. And now on to the next tornado. This tornado is one of the strongest of the 2011 super outbreak. Well, there were a lot of strong ones in the 2011 super outbreak. This one, however, Reed Timmer pretty much called a EF5 right off the bat. Like, he knew based on the motion of the tornado. And he knew that it was coming right toward them. It caused 2-foot trenches in the ground. It removed homes from their foundations, like lifted them off whole and splintered them into little bits. And it was probably just as strong as Smithville, just didn't hit as many structures as the Smithville one or the Rainsville one. However, this was the start. This was the starter cell of all the nasties that day, and it never got better. It didn't get, and it was possibly the smallest of the EF5s that day, though. It wasn't as large as those ones. And on to the next tornado. If ever there was a tornado that was way underrated, it was this one, the New Run tornado from the 2011 outbreak. This was a clear EF5 tornado. It scoured homes from the foundations, partially pulled up some of the foundations, threw a car into the water tower, very similar to what happened in Smithville, and ground scouring 2 feet deep. How is that an EF3? Yeah. Well, maybe it's because they didn't survey the area. It is the most underrated tornado in the history of tornadoes. I'm going to tell you that right now. And I believe, yeah, some people died there, and I'm just hoping that if there's ever a major tornado like that they actually survey the whole path, not over here, not over here, or even survey it at all. I can name another one like that where they didn't survey the worst of the damage, but this was pretty bad tornado. It was right up there with the Smithville, Rainsville, and some of those upper end ones that we did earlier in the video. However, it is in the position it is because it's unknown. Nobody knows how strong it truly was. But based on observations, it's definitely right up there with the strongest tornadoes of the 2011 outbreak. And that's the one thing that really makes me upset, is that they didn't go to New Wren and survey the damage. They basically left the rating as is and said, oh well. And yes, I understand they had several tornadoes to survey that day. I mean, you had many EF4, EF5 tornadoes that they had to survey that day, and this one got dropped through the cracks. And yes, that can happen when you have several damage paths and of that strength and everything. So let's hope that doesn't happen again. And on to the next tornado. Here is another tornado I consider underrated, as in, it's not an EF4, it's an EF5, in my opinion. Some foundations were partially pulled from the ground. That is right up there with like the top tornadoes in my list. And obviously, as we've all heard, that they didn't survey Bremen in those areas because they didn't have enough of a survey team due to COVID. Okay, that's understandable. That makes sense. But if you hear that's where the worst damage is, you go there. And you go to Mayfield, and you go to Case, and all those places, and Dawson Springs, and all that stuff. Homes were removed from foundations, but apparently they weren't well built enough to be EF5. That's probably true, but the 2-foot trenches over near Bremen, and the 1-foot trenches over by near Case, that tells me something more than any damage survey could tell me. I'm telling you right now. EF5 tornado, mid to upper grade, nothing, way underrated. And I can't blame the survey team because it was very small due to COVID. But there were clear indications that this was an EF5 and an upper end EF5 at that. And the one thing people seem to forget is this thing had 300-mile-an-hour gate-to-gate shear, at least. And that's right up there with the top tornadoes of all time, I'm telling you. And I could have rated this higher, but those tornadoes I rated higher than this one were definite. He deserved to be there, and I'm sorry to say, this is a symptom of the EF scale, in my opinion, that they don't use enough damage indicators, like tree debarking, or even trees completely cut down to the root, or ground scouring 2-foot deep trenches. I mean, this is where there's a little bit of fault in the EF system, and it can be refined. Now, on to the next tornado. This is the tornado that was the deadliest of the 21st century. It killed 161 people. Ouch. But it was not the strongest tornado on my list, though. It only showed very small pockets of EF5, and that was more toward the Rangeline Road area and over the Home Depot and like the Pizza Hut in that area. The reason this tornado was so deadly was that it blew up like from nothing to a low end EF5. It did that. It just went from little wispy to EF5 within a minute. It's a ridiculous thing to see. Oh, no wonder it killed so many people. Like, how do you warn for that? How do you warn for a tornado that does that? You really can't give much advance warning to people for that. But they should have taken the warning seriously. When the first tornado warning came out, they should have been in their shelters. They should have been set. But I think this is one of those few tornadoes where being above ground was not a good idea. You would have been best off being in an underground shelter. The reason many people didn't heed the warnings because there were so many false positives, as I call them. Yeah, they rang the sirens for a tornado 20 miles further north, or one that went 20 miles further south, and all that stuff. That when the actual thing happened, they didn't take it seriously. This is why I always tell people, take tornado warnings seriously. And as fast as this developed, they couldn't throw out a tornado emergency that quickly. It just wasn't possible. It was also the most costly tornado in American history, and wow is all I can say about that. And on to the next one. This one was the most recent EF5 or F5 tornado in the United States, officially. Now, there might have been others that weren't designated as such, but this was the most recent one, and it definitely was an EF5 tornado. It removed homes from foundations. There were a few trenches dug around the Plaza Towers Elementary School from this tornado. It completely knocked down the school and killed 8 children there. I'm sorry, that just makes me upset when I hear about our future being killed by a tornado. I'm telling you there. Those kids were there for an education, and they didn't make it. 20 some odd people died in this tornado. And it was quite strong. It wasn't quite up to the tornadoes before it on the list, but it was an EF5. Well, maybe Joplin, but the pure power to pick up a 20-ton tank and throw it into a neighborhood, that was definitely an EF5 tornado. And the debarking of trees, the trees were pretty much taken down to the ground, like turned into the debris. That is something very common in EF5 tornadoes. And you could see the granulation of the debris. That is something that is very common in EF5 tornadoes. That's one of the reasons this was that. And it didn't just become an EF5. It did a gradual growth to an EF5. Like, you could watch it turn from a single vortex to a multi-vortex as it moved along. Very common in tornadoes like this. And it dissipated right over by Tinker Air Force Base. And it's one of those tornadoes that won't be forgotten because it was the last EF5. And now we're going to move on to the next tornado. And it's another one that went right over an Air Force Base. This tornado touched down around Hayesville, Kansas as an F2 tornado, became an F3 tornado as it was crossing the highway, and as it was moving into McConnell Air Force Base, it had become an F4 tornado, causing severe damage to some of the housing in that area, and a couple of the airplane hangars, or jet hangars as you might call them, and then moved on into Andover, Kansas. And you can guess what happened as it moved out of the base. It basically became an F5 tornado. And it's probably stronger than a couple of the tornadoes that I listed before. But it was a nasty tornado, though. Some of the greatest motion ever seen in a tornado. I'll tell you that. I've never seen rising motion in a tornado like that. I mean, this might have been one of the stronger tornadoes in history, to be honest with you. And it killed a lot of people, mostly in mobile homes. Why? Because they didn't go to shelter. And it even killed a few people that weren't in mobile homes, that were in regular homes that got literally picked up off their foundations. Well-built homes, to be exact. And rest in peace to those people, because this one definitely is in the upper echelon of tornadoes. And if you think I put this too low on the list, please let me know below. And we're going to move on to the next tornado, but not before I say this. This tornado almost hit two B-2 bombers with nuclear warheads on them. Well, let's just say, if it had done that, it would have been a nuclear tornado. One we've never seen before. Woohoo! But well, now on to the next tornado. This cell actually began in the very northern end of Oklahoma, and it had started to drop a tornado there. It kept dropping little tornadoes and all that, and then suddenly it dropped a big one. And the big one that it dropped was this one. And it grew to a 2.2 miles wide. That's a big tornado, no matter what you say. And this had some of the strongest velocities that I've seen. 240 knots gate-to-gate shear. Are you kidding me? That's 285, 290 miles per hour. That is definitely up there in the upper echelon of tornadoes. not quite to the point of like the Piedmont, El Reno, or Bridge Creek tornadoes. It's just below them, but this was a lot larger. It was moving a little slower than those tornadoes were. And one thing I gotta say about this tornado is, yes, it removed homes off their foundations, like picked them up and turned them into granulated debris. It dug trenches into the ground, very much a hallmark of any EF5 we've ever heard of. Literally every building in the town of Greensburg was destroyed, or in a quarter of the homes were removed from their foundations. That's an absolutely top tier tornado. I might have put this a little lower on my list than I should have. I should have put it a little higher, but when you're trying to make a list of these things, you're going to leave out some things. You're going to put things lower on the list than you want to, but that's why this was a hard list to come up with. But this tornado literally removed a town from the map. It would later cause another large, extremely large and dangerous tornado in Trousdale, which was just as big and just as strong, but it hit only farmland and all that. It didn't really hit any homes, except for one or two, and that was at the edge of the tornado, causing EF3 damage. So, yes, this supercell caused many large and dangerous tornadoes, and I'm going to say this about the Greensburg tornado. It's one of the top 5 largest tornadoes of all time. Yeah. And that was horrible when you say large and extremely dangerous. This is one of those that I think deserved a tornado emergency, and I think it did get a tornado emergency. And on to the last tornado on our main list, and this one happened almost 100 years ago. Here is the tornado of all tornadoes, in my opinion, even though I put it at number 20. It may not have been the strongest tornado, but it was definitely the most deadly tornado. And this was the 1925 Tri-State tornado. And I think it might have been as strong as the Hackleburg-Phil Campbell tornado. And the funny thing is, I think it looks exactly the same as that tornado. Let me get you started. It started off in Missouri. And it quickly became an F5 tornado. In half the time it was rain wrapped, so you could not see it coming, even though it was there. You could hear it coming, but you couldn't see it. And a lot of the times it looked like a big bubbly cloud in the distance. That's just the debris circling around the condensation funnel and the multiple vortices and all that stuff, and dirt being pulled from the ground. There were trenches, but believe you me, there were trenches in several places. Even in Indiana, where it caused the worst damage. Yes, Indiana. It may have been as strong as some of the top of our list tornadoes at that point. And this sucker, yeah, well, it turned into a real Hoover, but it went on for over 200 miles. No other tornado has done that. The Hackleburg Phil Campbell went 131 miles. The Bremen Mayfield Dawson Springs, East Kentucky tornado went 160 some odd miles. Yeah, this one was the king. This one destroyed anything it touched. It flattened everything, removed almost everything from their foundations, pulled up a few foundations partially in Indiana. It's one of the strongest tornadoes that has ever happened in the United States. It's the deadliest tornado that's ever happened in the United States. And I don't think you're going to see that many people die in a tornado ever again. Hundreds. Just hundreds. Horrible. And they probably didn't even know it was a tornado. They probably thought it was a rain shaft or just a low cloud. Back then, they didn't know what multiple vortices were. They didn't know what a wedge tornado was. They thought a wedge tornado was just a rain shaft. Back then. So, that's what caught many people off guard and killed them. So, and now, we're going to go on to the honorable mentions that did not make the list, but I could have put them on the list, and they would have fit perfectly, in my opinion. So, let's get started with the first one. These honorable mentions are going to be ones I could have put on the list and might be on your list, but aren't on mine. But we start with the first one, which was the one that happened in 2011 in Tuscaloosa and Birmingham. And I'm going to say this. It was not at peak strength in Tuscaloosa or Birmingham. I'm going to say that right now. I think it weakened some coming in. Before coming into Birmingham, it did strengthen back up a little bit to a borderline EF4, EF5. But do I think this was a strong EF5 like some of the other tornadoes in this outbreak? I'm going to say yes. It was in forested area between Brookwood and Hueytown. And I believe it was just as strong as those tornadoes in that area. And it goes to show that even though it didn't hit at peak intensity, it killed 66 people. That was awful. And could have been worse if it had hit those cities at peak intensity. The one other thing that this thing had was ground scouring to the point where there were trenches in the forested area, not in any place that was built up. That tells me something. That tells me something. That both Birmingham and Tuscaloosa got lucky that they didn't get something even stronger, because it peaked right between the two. And that's all I'm going to say about that. And on to the next honorable mention. This tornado was one of two really bad tornadoes in 1953. I could have included it on the main list, but there were more larger tornadoes and worse tornadoes, and This tornado killed 180 some odd people. It was obviously an F5. It completely wiped out the entire town. Some homes were moved off of their foundations. And this is the largest tornado of the year, I'm gonna say. And there ain't much more I can say about this one, except it was a big one for Texas. Not quite as big as Gerald, but it was a big one for Texas. And on to the next one. This tornado is another one I feel was underrated, as it had all the hallmarks of an F5 tornado. I'll tell you what, it killed 6 people, mostly in mobile homes. It scoured the ground to a foot deep, which is very much a hallmark of an F5 tornado. Sorry to say. It destroyed trees. I mean, like the vegetation damage was very similar to an F5 tornado. It's just it didn't hit a lot of homes, which is probably why it didn't get an F5 rating. However, I will always call this an F5 tornado no matter what anyone says, and it is the strongest tornado in the history of South Dakota. And the deadliest. Yeah. Which means you usually don't get tornadoes of that strength in South Dakota. I'll tell you that. And let's move on to the next honorable mention. This tornado was another really nasty tornado in that 1991 outbreak in the Midwest. We covered the Andover, Kansas tornado, but this one might have been just as strong, if not stronger, than that one. However, it didn't hit many structures. It stayed mostly in fields, which only gave it an F4 rating. However, the motion on this thing was absolutely insane. It was basically a clone of Andover, Kansas, but it was in fields. It did cause a lot of ground scouring, wind rowing, and all that stuff. Very typical of a major tornado in a field. And it did catch a couple of structures, but I don't think it caught those structures with the core. That's why it was only rated an F4. And I'm gonna say this right now. This was probably the strongest tornado of the outbreak, alongside Andover, Kansas. And this is probably the most forgotten tornado of the outbreak, too. So, for those that study tornadoes and all that, this is one I would look at as one of the strongest of all time. And on to the next one. This tornado was the furthest north and east that any tornado F5 tornado has ever formed, other than Flint. This one was not that large in size. It was fairly small for an F5 tornado, but It moved homes off foundations. It dug some trenches about a foot deep. It killed several people. It was a very bad tornado for that area. Usually you don't get tornadoes that strong in that area. And it was horrible. It wasn't as strong as some of the other F5s on our list. And it was barely as strong as some of the higher end F4s on the list. But what I'm going to say about this one is the geographical location. Like I said, it was a rare occurrence for something like this. Yeah, you've had F4 tornadoes in Connecticut and Massachusetts, but you've never had an F5 there. So this was a first for that area, and hopefully a last. Now on to the next one. It clearly can be seen in the photograph. This tornado is a multi-vortex tornado, and it cleared homes off of their foundations. It did widespread vegetation damage. It dug trenches into the ground, and it was in a very rare location, Flint, Michigan. The furthest north that a tornado has formed of that magnitude, other than the Chandler 1992 one. And this one killed a lot of people. It killed a lot of people, and it wasn't the only strong tornado of 1953. Literally a day later, Worcester got an EF4 or an F4 tornado, and it killed like 40 some odd people there. That's something that's awful. Back to Flint, though. It's Michigan's only F5 tornado in its history, and as you can see by looking at the tornado and looking what it did, it's no shock it was an F5. And on to the next one.